Hey, SoulHub family. Welcome to this dynamic class where we're discussing the hidden nature of the egoic mind and how it imprisons you. So needless to say, we're going to dive deep. There's going to be a lot to learn in this class. And hopefully what you'll come away with is understanding what the ego is, all of the traps that it gets you in, and then how to transcend them to live a much more meaningful, joyful, abundant, loving life, which is what we all want at the true deep soul level. So without further ado, that's Tom Cox. I'm Ziad Masri, and let's take it away.
All right, so we got a pretty important question. We're going to be talking about the ego. So I think what we should start off with is discussing what the ego is exactly, according to your understanding.
Yeah, it's a good question because a lot of times in normal life, like in everyday parlance, we say, oh, that person has a big ego, meaning like they're arrogant. But that's not what we mean when we're talking about the ego from a spiritual or even psychological perspective. But when we say ego or the egoic mind, what we mean is that separate sense of self. The sense that I am this body, I am this person, this personality, and I am separate from you, and I'm separate from the world and the universe, and I exist, completely separate. And so that's what the ego means at its core. It's the essential sense of separation, the existential sense of separation. And it causes a lot of problems, needless to say, which we'll get into, but that's what really the ego is. It's your sense of self.
So when people normally think of the ego, they think of something, as you just said, it creates a sense of self, right? Mm-hmm. But there's also a sense of self that comes with simply being conscious. Like, for example, when you pay attention to your own self-awareness, okay, mm-hmm. like the divine witness at the core of your consciousness. So are these two things the same thing, and how do they compare in your mind?
Yeah, no, they're not the same thing. So there is a sense of self that is only a sense of beingness, right? So, and that would be the true consciousness. That sense of self is not the individual I that I think myself to be. That sense of self is just a sense of existence, or a sense of just pure direct perception without any relation to this person that I think I am. Okay. And that one is just, again, pure awareness, pure perception of what is happening in the now moment. And usually it's just pure experiential from a sensory level. And then, of course, there's the subtle senses. So it could be experiencing a sense of peace and love and joy. That's what it usually characterizes it. But also just pure sensory experience of sounds and smell and taste and touch without the mental commentary. And that's the I am principle, just pure existence, right? But then the egoic sense of self is always the I thought and how it relates to the rest of the world. So, I am a male. I have this history. I want this. I don't want this. I like this. I don't like this. I feel good. I don't feel, it's all these things of how it relates to me as a person. That's the egoic sense of self. The other one is just pure existence. And everyone's actually had a taste of that where, let's say you see a beautiful sight, nature, and for a moment it completely stills your mind and you're just in pure awareness, in pure perception, perceiving it, and it's beautiful and it's joyful. That's the true consciousness. Everything else, this other sense of self, is just actually a thought. It's a thought process. Whereas the real self-awareness that you're talking about is not a thought process. All right. It's actually just a pure awareness. And that's the difference.
So it's a thought construct or a thought process versus something more universal that's always there in the background.
Yeah, that's how I would say it. The other one is literally a thought construct. It's not real. So that's why you hear in spiritual circles, everyone's saying that, the ego is an illusion. The reason why it's an illusion is because it only exists when there's thought, when you're thinking. It is actually not an entity or a thing. We talk about it like, oh, the ego is this thing. It's me, whatever. But really, it's just a process of thinking. the moment you are not thinking, let's say you're in pure stillness in meditation, or again, you saw something that stunned you into silence or something like that. Where is this I? It doesn't exist in that moment. It only comes into existence once again when the thought process starts, and now there is the illusion of continuity because the mind takes memory from the past, right? And it projects a future, and it says, oh, I am this thing. Whereas it's just a thought process of a bunch of memories and a future that doesn't actually exist, and it makes it seem into this real thing. And the reality is, even your own bodies, they say something like the cells completely, die off and regenerate once every 7 years or something like that, which means that who you were a few years ago or when you were born or whatever is literally, as a body, it's completely changed. There's none of that left. It's something completely new, right? And yet we think we are this same sense of, we still have the sense of self, right? And we have this history and we have all these memories. And so that's what we think brings us continuity. But in reality, the only thing that's actually continuous is that background of awareness that is watching these changing thoughts and the illusion of the self that thinks it is this history and this future, whereas all there is really now, and everything else is illusory.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, that totally fits with all my observations too. So, but then the question is, if we are this background of awareness, if that's what we are, then why do we have an ego in the first place? Like, how did it come into being, and why is it there at all?
Yeah. So that's a good question. So what we truly are at our core is pure consciousness, or in spiritual terms, pure spirit. And as that, we would not be able to experience physicality without a separate sense of self. And the reason for that is because we would literally be essentially this pure oneness, and there would be no differentiation. And so we need some sort of mechanism like the ego to retain a sense of individuality, to be able to experience the physical realm, so to say. And without that, it's virtually impossible to experience it. There's actually a lady by the name, I think, of Jill Taylor, who's actually a neuroscientist, who years ago just suddenly had this stroke, and the left hemisphere of her brain got completely shut down. And that's actually what's been proven to create the sense of self in the brain as an actual neurological mechanism. And it completely shut down, and it left her with only the right brain. And so now there is no sense of self. There is no ego, so to say, even on a biological level. And she couldn't function. She couldn't remember a phone number. She couldn't dial a phone. She couldn't walk. She couldn't tell the difference between the wall and her. Everything was just a oneness. And there was no body that was separate from anything else. So she couldn't differentiate between anything. So she was literally non-functional, which shows you that as beautiful, and that was a stunningly blissful experience, as she describes, pure bliss, pure peace, pure love, joy, because that's what there is when the ego is removed, which we'll talk about. But it's also non-functional. So, it's kind of like, well, if we're here to experience physicality and the illusion of this separation and what it's like, then we need the ego. Now, the issue is it's really not the mechanism that gives us a sense of individuality and separation that's the problem. It's that it has gotten out of control. It is like this tool that has become proclaimed to become the master and sat on the throne and is pretending to be us. That's the issue here. So initially, in terms of just what it's supposed to do, and it allows us to survive. It allows us to differentiate, to even create language, and all these things that help us function in the physical realm. But it's kind of basically gone rogue, and it's usurped the throne, and now it's in charge. And it makes for a lousy master. It's a very good servant, but a lousy master. And so that's kind of, what's occurred here. So we needed it, or we still need it in a way to experience this realm, but not in the form that it is evolved to, which is completely out of control. And it's kind of gone purely insane from that perspective.
So could you get more into the nature of the ego? Because it's good talking about its functions, right? But what about its actual nature? Well, what do you know of that?
Yeah, well, I mean, one good way to qualify its nature would be to call it insane. The reason why it can be called insane is because it views everything as separate from it.
Mm.
And so it views the entire world through a lens of fear. And the lens of fear creates this, kill or be killed mentality, from the most subtle to the most obvious forms. Now, we in society, we usually think of insane people and the ones in the mental institute, or the psychos that are killing people. We think those are insane people, and we think we're all quote unquote normal, right? But we don't recognize the insanity at the heart of our quote unquote normal existence and way of being, because it's just much more subtle. And we can get into that, but I mean, that's the reality of it. It's just more subtle, and because it's all still based on the idea that we are actually separate from everything and everyone, right? It was supposed to be, the ego is supposed to create the illusion of separation so we can, experience physicality and not, again, merge into everything else and not be able to differentiate. But it wasn't supposed to make us believe that that's true. And once we believe that that's true, that's where all the negative things come about. That's when hatred and greed and anger and abuse and everything comes about. Why? Because, again, we think we are truly separate. And so, we want to survive at all costs, even if it means at the expense of others, at exploiting others, manipulating others, and not just for survival purposes, to get psychological needs met, for approval, for a million other reasons. So that's the nature of the ego. It's basically, if you want to think of it in these terms, the source of what people call evil, the source of anything negative, comes from the ego. It does not come from who we truly are, right? It does not come from our true nature, which is pure love. So that's how I would characterize the ego. It's everything negative and not good. It comes from the ego. So it's kind of like that fallen human, if you want to call it that. That's the egoic self.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it, because there is a definite level of insanity to it. And by insanity, we ultimately mean something that's not true, something that's based in illusion, and something that doesn't question itself. Because when you're in this mode of ego, when you're in that mode, you don't normally question your reality. You don't question your own reality and what you are, right?
No.
So it seems almost like the ego is being driven by something that is not rational, not truly conscious, which, brings up the question, like, what is the tie between the ego and the subconscious? Because, it seems to be driven by something down there, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the bulk of the ego is in the subconscious or the unconscious mind. I think that's why it's so difficult to deal with, is because we're not aware of its core. Much of it is hidden. It's like an iceberg. You see the tip, and the tip is, the crazy behavior people engage in, whether it's, again, something extreme like war or violence, or something very seemingly minor, like, just arguments and conflict and all that. But at the core, it's still the same idea. The same source is creating it. And that is largely subconscious. Yeah. So that's why most people are not aware of it. They just think, well, this is me. They just think, oh, these are my thoughts, not realizing they're being sprung from a place that is kind of hidden in the darkness, to use a kind of an analogy. And that's the subconscious or unconscious mind. So the ego really is, at its core, a set of conditioning or programming that lays deep beneath the surface. It is, it can be looked at from an emotional level as a set of unresolved, unprocessed emotions from childhood, from past lives, from everything that has essentially bundled into, come together, all these different forces into like this dysfunctional, quote unquote, whole that is acting as seemingly one thing, but is really, an infinite number of forces and unrepressed emotions and neurological conditioning. There's the biology of it, there's the emotions of it, and then there's the psychology of it, which is the subconscious or unconscious mind. So they all tie in together. I look at them as different vantage points of looking at the same thing.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned one of the contributions to that just being our programming, and which makes sense because when you look at infants, they don't really have much ego when they're born. They start out with almost no ego, and as they grow up, at some point you can tell. I mean, I noticed this in my siblings when I was raising them, that something like an ego starts kicking in. A couple of years into it, so around age 4 or 5, 6, something like that.
Well, I would say 2. That's why they call it the terrible twos. when they start developing that sense of self, and then of course it intensifies. But it's those first few years of life.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. So we talked about how the ego is kind of rooted in the subconscious, almost like the tip of the iceberg. One thing I wanted to ask about that was, when you talked about emotional traumas, so you're talking about painful experiences that we undergo at an early age that somehow get buried deep within us, and they contain some sort of negative program that then manifests through the ego. Is that essentially what you're saying?
Yeah, I would say that when we're young, we are not necessarily capable of knowing how to cope with traumatic experiences. Traumatic experiences can be extreme again. So as you see, I'm always talking about a spectrum, but it's the same thing. It's just how extreme is it? So the extreme is something like physical or sexual abuse or something like that. But then something subtle could be, you're a baby or you're young and you're crying and your parents don't come right away to feed you or something and you feel abandoned. That's a traumatic experience for a child, and they don't know how to cope with that. So that gets every one of these experiences gets registered, literally gets kind of trapped in the cellular structure, even these emotions of the body. And so that's what I'm talking about. And then what ends up being is that these things stay there and they keep accumulating, and essentially they're energy, and energy is always kind of seeking like energy. So what'll happen is, like, let's say now we're an adult, right? And something will happen. Something could be something minor, and it could trigger rage in us and super anger. And you see that in people. Like sometimes they just blow up, and you're like, well, how does this cause that, right? And it's because it triggers. It's a similar energy that creates this almost a reminder of the same pattern within from deep childhood. This unconscious. The person is completely unaware of it, but it resonates on that same frequency. And once that occurs, it triggers what's inside. And then that, almost like you could think of it as an analogy of wanting to be fed. Like it wants to perpetuate itself. So what does it do? It creates that emotion so strongly that it creates a behavior that intensifies it and brings that emotion back in to essentially feed on itself. That's why, someone who's angry, their anger makes them more angry, and it creates behavior in them that creates conflict that brings even more anger, right? Someone who's frustrated because of their complaining and frustration is going to become more and more frustrated, and they're going to frustrate others, which are going to frustrate them. So it always attracts back to its own nature to feed on itself. It has its own survival mechanism. It wants to continue to exist in that form, in that pattern. It's like this loop that keeps playing and just drawing things to it over and over and over.
So it has a use for allowing us to experience this illusion, this reality here, but it's a double-edged sword, because for all the reasons that you just said, which is that it's a self-perpetuating inner little predator or parasite in a way.
Yeah.
Feeding off others and then getting hurt in turn, which makes it have to feed even more. And I can see how that would create a total meltdown in some people's lives where and that also goes for a lot of the goals. I mean, not the negative stuff, but a lot of the illusory goals that the ego has, things that it wants to maybe fill some void within, or somehow make up for an unacknowledged emotional repression that it can't fully express, right? So it finds all these different substitutes to go for, and that can ultimately lead down a very unfulfilling path, can it?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think that's a really key point. It's the idea of the ego is a thought of lack. So see how we can look at it from literally a million different vantage points. We can define it in different ways, and they all make sense in their own way. So the ego is a thought of lack. Why? Well, because if the ego is the sense of separation from the whole, from source, from creation itself, then obviously it's going to feel lacking, right? It's going to feel like it's this tiny little me against this infinite universe. And so it is it's an idea of incompletion, again, because it's cut off from the whole. And so it's always going to be feeling like it needs to fill that. And of course, the repressed emotions and all that definitely don't help. You know, if you were, let's say, abused, it's only going to intensify the existential sense of lack that you already feel just by thinking that you're this ego. And now you're going to think, well, I was unloved, now I want love. I did not get approval, now I want approval, and all the other forms that it takes.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. So yeah, I mean, the double-edged sword nature of it, it kind of, it definitely keeps us imprisoned in many ways. You know, so let's get into some of the ways that the ego actually does imprison us. I mean, for all its usefulness in some context, how does it keep us down, do you think?
Oh yeah, I mean there are there are a ton of ways that the ego can keep us down. The first thing, well, let's get into all the different ways that that it essentially traps us and it creates negativity. All right, in our lives. So let's start with that. So one of the main ways that the ego traps us, I would say, is in the idea of judgment. The ego is based on judgment. Think about it. It's an idea of separation. You're thinking you're separate from everything in the whole. You're not only not interconnected with them, but you're not one with them. And so the idea is that every time you judge, you reinforce that. Every time you think you are, you know, you're better than someone, or someone is wrong, or you hate someone, or you look down on someone, whatever it is, right? That's that kind of judgment. That's egoic judgment. And so that reinforces the sense of separation and reinforces you as separate from that individual. And it's basically reinforcing the ego. And of course, it creates, we think judgment is like this thing that gratifies us, like when we think we're better than someone, you know, but in reality, if we really check in, it always makes us feel worse, because whenever we judge someone, one, again, we're feeling a lack of connection with them, but two, there's always a negative feeling about that judgment that registers within our being, right? And it actually doesn't feel good if we were to just do a comparison, because the ego fools us. Again, it's really good at this. It fools us into feeling like judgment is a gratification. Like, can you believe that person? How can they possibly act like that? Or look at these sick people and what they do. Let's say if we're talking about murderers or something, right? And it makes us feel completely righteous and justified in the judgment. And whether there's obviously, you know, I'm not saying that murder is a good thing, obviously not, but ask yourself, if you were actually to do this little experiment, what good comes from making that judgment? I mean, literally nothing. It's obvious that, you know, something like murder or violence or whatever it is isn't good, right? It doesn't need this voice in our head to make us feel better than that. And that's really the underlying assumption here. It's not like this thing, oh, how could they do that? They're horrible. Really, what we're saying is I'm better because I don't do that. I mean, that's always the underlying assumption in the ego. Now, imagine that and actually experiment with that and just feel the ego's telling you, yeah, this makes me feel better, but it's this, for lack of a better word, icky kind of feeling better. It doesn't feel really good. Now, compare that directly with, think of something negative and feel this sense of love and forgiveness and compassion. Like, fine, that is what they're doing is very terrible, but they don't know what they're doing because they're caught in their own ego. And I feel compassion for the suffering that they're creating and they're experiencing on a deep level. And then feel that. Obviously, you're going to feel always, always, always much better with the compassion, which shows that the ego lies to you and tells you that judgment feels good, but it really doesn't feel good at all. And then beyond that, what we end up creating, because we know it doesn't feel good at our core, we end up creating this unconscious guilt that comes along with it. We start feeling guilty and, you know, again, that gets pushed down into unconscious because we don't want to feel the guilt, and it just perpetuates the whole thing. So that's one of the major ways, is judgment. So that's something to really watch out for whenever you're judging, thinking that you're just stating something like righteous good or something like obvious. Really, there's always another intention. The ego is ingenious at this, and the other intention is to say that I am better because I don't do this. That's all. And which accentuates the sense of I and gets you further into the illusion and the trap. So that's number one. You want to be essentially moving towards the sense of I am, the presence, the existence, the awareness that we talked about earlier, right? You want to be moving towards that sense of background, peace and love and joy, and just pure direct perception that is not related to this I thought. And every time you judge, you are just reinforcing the I thought. So you're moving away from peace and love and joy and all that. Okay, so that's one of the ways. And there are almost infinite ways, but I'm gonna discuss the major ones that really, these that I'm gonna discuss are essentially gonna encapsulate the vast majority of the main traps that the ego gets you in. So the second trap that many people don't realize is desire. So desire is lauded as this amazing good thing. There's been books and books and books written about how, you know, you need to have strong desire, and our whole society, essentially our whole culture, is based on, you know, looking up to and praising ambition because it's full of desire, right? The athletes have this desire to win, the businessmen have desire to come on top. And we think that's something amazing. But there's a very sinister truth at the core of it. And it's, of course, the ego. But why? So let's discuss why. And I'll also let you know why I don't think desire is actually needed in the way that it's experienced. So we think desire is good because it's what makes us get better. It's what makes us create. And if we didn't have desire, we would just be passive and lazy and just, you know, we wouldn't contribute to society. We wouldn't become better. Again, that's the lie that the ego spins. So and each one of these, I'll tell you essentially the lie that the ego is spinning and how it traps us. So that's the lie. And they all seem convincing. Obviously, if they weren't convincing, we wouldn't fall for them. So they all seem extremely rational and like, well, of course, how could it be any other way? So the desire is essentially trapping you into a present state of lack and expecting that lack will be fulfilled in the future. All right. So you're saying, until I meet my desire, I am lacking in some way, and therefore I am unhappy and I'm not at peace until I have my desire met. So instantly, the moment you believe a desire and you start really experiencing it, you are already trapped by the ego. You're already in a state of lack, and therefore in a state of lack of peace. And so there, instantly, it's taking a step away from your true nature. Even the desire for enlightenment or spiritual progress, which seems, again, this is how tricky the ego is. It can shroud its true, you know, intention in something that seems super positive. Let's say you have the desire to help, you know, remove poverty from the earth, or the desire to meet things that seem amazingly positive, right? But there's a way that even if the desire initially is coming from your true nature, and I want to differentiate between language is difficult sometimes. So I'm not saying that any will or intention or pull or longing of the soul to move in a certain direction is a negative desire that always gets no. So we all come with some built-in, I'm still going to call them desires, but I'm going to differentiate them from egoic desires. Some built-in desires that are aligned with our true nature, that are more of a flow. They don't create a sense of lack in the present, right? They they are more of a flow towards harmony, towards love, towards something else that feel peaceful in the present. They don't take you away. They don't think when I achieve this in the future, then I'll be happy now, right? They don't put you in that trap. They're just a natural flow of where your soul or your true being wants to take you. That is let's say what I would call a good desire. And we have those, and that's why without desire of the ego, it's not like we would be stuck and doing nothing. Quite the contrary. We would be our best selves. We would be progressing towards that without any hindrance. We would be helping people. We would be helping the world naturally in the flow. The egoic desires, however, actually stop us from doing that, even though they tell us that they're doing these great things. Why? One is they put us in a lower vibrational state, in a state of lack of peace in the present. But then two, they get us completely stuck in the future. Right. So now we are no longer here and now, attending to the here and now. We are in an imaginary realm in our mind, and stuck, essentially stuck there in a fantasy realm, living there because the present feels unbearable because I don't have what I'm desiring. So it's a giant trap. And often the desires themselves are not meaningful. It's a desire for, let's say, more money or more. It's usually related to comfort. That's what the ego wants. It wants comfort. So, the desire for more money, the desire for a better, bigger house, a better car, all these things, a better relationship, but feeling negative that either I don't have one or I have a negative or whatever it may be. So it's always a rejection of the now, a rejection of what is, and a fantasy about what could be or what should be. So it's literally a war with reality. Whereas the true desires that come from yourselves are not at war with reality. They're in full allowance of what is in this moment while moving towards greater harmony or greater abundance or greater peace or greater love, right? They're not fighting with it. And that's the key. And so again, the lie is the ego tells you you need these other desires, but the truth is that they only cause suffering and they only cause pain and they only take you away from your true nature. And there is a way to differentiate. I'll just throw this in there now. Differentiate between an egoic desire and a desire that's coming from your true nature. And the way to differentiate is very simple. We've been given a compass straight in our body and a gauge, and it's how does it make you feel energetically within your body. If a desire brings any sense of energetic contraction, of a feeling of lack, of a feeling of not good enough, a feeling of restlessness, of grasping for anything in the future, you can know it's coming from your ego or that the ego has co-opted it. Sometimes you can have a true natural urge, for instance, to be of service in the world or something, but the ego can come in and completely co-opt that and make you feel like, oh my God, I have to do this, and get all restless and get all rushed. And then that's just the ego that's taken a genuine longing of the soul and taken it over. But most of the time it's just pure egoic desires that won't actually bring us happiness. And we know because we never actually end up happy, no matter how many of them we fulfill. So that's another big trap of the ego. A third huge trap of the ego is regret, which gets you stuck in the past. Now, regret is another lie that the ego spins and tells you the past could have been different than what it was. And not only could it have been, but it should have been. Or, of course, the truth of the matter is it couldn't have been and it shouldn't have been, no matter how horribly seeming it was, no matter what you did or what anyone else did. Why? Because there's no way it could have been. We think that it was just us and we were responsible for this or that. The reality is that there was an infinite number of unforeseen forces and events and circumstances, and everything else that has happened in history up until that point had to happen that way for whatever occurred to occur, even the seemingly smallest thing. And because it happened that way, that's what had to occur. And so it couldn't have been different. And so it's a lie. And not other than the fact that it's a lie, what good does it do? I mean, the past is done. There's literally nothing you can learn from it. That's good, but that's not regret. Again, that's something positive that comes from your true self. The ego is resisting, and this is a key thing, it's always about resistance, right? It's resisting the past, it's wanting it to be different, therefore wasting the present and wasting its current energy trying to change something that is impossible to change. So this is a completely futile thing. But what does it do? It keeps us feeling unhappy, ungrateful, not in the now, and further accentuating or further propagating this sense of I that thinks it does exist in the past, and it creates that sense of me by always focusing on the past, because it seems like it's this continuous entity, even though it's really just a thought process happening in the now. And if you were to turn off the thought process, where is that I? There's just awareness. So that's another thing it does. Another trap, a major trap of the ego, is worry, fear. Again, why? It's completely future-based, and it spins the lie that if I don't worry about the future, something bad will happen and I won't be taken care of. And it's a very convincing lie. We know we all fall into that. If I don't worry about this, then how am I going to take care of it? And that assumes what? That assumes that there is this separate me that has the power to control the future and to do everything it can to keep itself safe and comfortable and so forth. When in reality, there is life itself, the universe itself is flowing and taking care of it. And if you were to experiment with not trying to figure it out or trying to control it, you'd see just how much smoother it actually flows. What we don't realize that it's happening with the ego is that every time we try to control the ego, the future, every time we try to control it or worry about it, we're actually creating more suffering in the now, and we're actually creating a worse future, because energy just leads to more of its kind and attracts more of it. So the more we do that here, the more we're actually making things worse, thinking that, well, I'm just figuring it out and making myself safer. But if we were to actually let go, the future would flow much, much better than us trying to control it. So again, another lie, another trap, and it doesn't actually work. Another trap of the ego is this constant seeking of pleasure, wanting to be in comfort and moving away from discomfort, which is, again, seemingly natural. And of course it says, well, of course life is about pleasure. Of course I want pleasure. And of course I don't want to feel uncomfortable. And yet the issue with that is it creates, again, a sense of, unless I'm experiencing pleasure right now, something's wrong. Well, of course, that's not realistic. You can't always be experiencing pleasure in life. Of course, there's going to be discomfort, whether physical or emotional, whatever it may be. And if you judge that as wrong and always want to get away from it back towards pleasure, you're just living on this dichotomy or duality that is always keeping you unhappy and always in resistance to the now, which makes you lack peace. And so if you were, and experiment with this too, if you were to, even in discomfort, fully allow it, right? Fully allow the discomfort, you would see that all of a sudden it becomes good. And I'll tell you something funny, kind of anecdote about this. I'm very ticklish. And sometimes my wife will come and just start tickling me, and I'll start uncontrollably laughing. It'll be like this tickle war, and she won't stop. And all of a sudden I'll go what I call going Yoda on her. So I'm like, okay, I'm going Yoda on you. And no matter what she does, I'm like just sitting there, and I can't be tickled, and it frustrates the hell out of her. But how does that happen? Well, it happens simply when I stop resisting the tickling and I literally fully embrace it, like fully welcome it in the moment, just fully like, this is what I want. And all of a sudden, it stops being this thing that I can't handle. I still feel the tickling, but it's not negative anymore. It's strange. And then, of course, she stops, which is another interesting thing that occurs, is whatever you've been resisting will keep persisting until you stop resisting, and often it just stops. And so that's a funny way to kind of prove that. But that happens every month or so. She forgets that I can go Yoda on her, and she starts tickling me, and I forget, which is, again, the funny conditioning initially I resist every time. I forget that I could just, well, I'm like, wait, oh yeah. And then I just, or sometimes I do it just to give her, a little bit of a laugh, but then, then I welcome it and then it stops. So that's another thing, to know. Another major trap of the ego is keeping us distracted, to escape the now. This is a huge one. Distraction, TV, movies, the gym, food, conversation, anything. It can literally use anything. Again, it's ingenious. It can literally use anything to keep us distracted. And every time it'll have a great excuse. Well, I'm really tired. Why would I just sit here and just be? Of course I'm going to, watch TV, or being just sitting and being is boring. There's nothing happening. Of course I need entertainment, or I'm hungry. I need that food, even though you're really not, or whatever it is. It's just distracting you from being now. Now, why does this occur? Why do you have this? Well, first, because in the now, it doesn't exist. If you were just to be in the now and not be in the thought stream, the ego doesn't exist. Well, obviously it wants to exist. So it's going to do everything in its power to keep you from being in the now. That's why the ego hates meditation. Right? That's why when people start meditating, their mind goes crazy. That's the ego trying to rip you out of that now moment so it can stay in command. And the only way it can stay in command is by keeping your attention on the thought stream, and then you follow that thought stream. So it says, go eat a cookie, you go eat a cookie. Go watch a TV show, go watch a TV show. So you're following its commands, and then it's in control and it has you fooled. So that's another thing that it does. Now, the reason why it's so hard to just be is not just because we think it's boring. It's also because if we just be and we just sit there, we don't try to escape the now moment, what'll happen is all this unresolved emotion that we've been pushing down and not wanting to feel and using anytime it comes up to be felt, we look for an escape, right? I feel uncomfortable. I feel restless. What do I do? Oh, let me go watch a movie. Oh, I feel better. Oh, let me call a friend. Oh, I feel better. Oh, let me go exercise. Oh, I feel better. Right? Not saying that you shouldn't call friends or watch a movie or exercise. I'm just saying, if you feel a genuine longing to do that, sure. But if you feel a restlessness and a negative energy inside and you're trying to escape that by doing those things, that's where the trap is, right? And so it basically takes us away from experiencing the discomfort with awareness. And if we were to, each time we experience these unresolved emotions from a state of awareness, we actually heal them. Awareness has this magical, mysterious healing capability because it is actually formless love. And so when they are just seeking not only to perpetuate themselves, but seeking attention, validation, because they've been pushed down into the, imagine this thing's been pushed down into the dungeons. It just wants to be validated, to be approved of. And so just being aware and witnessing them with that loving, compassionate presence actually heals them, actually liberates them. But the ego doesn't allow us to do that. It causes us to seek escape after escape, and which causes us to just keep these things pushed inside, and they keep triggering, and we keep getting angry and upset and sad and all that. It's just, that's what it does. It's really good at that. Another trap is taking things personally. So anytime someone says anything that could be for our benefit, we take it personally, right? And so of course the ego is the sense of personhood. If I just realize that I am awareness itself, what could I take personally? Nothing. I would just fully accept everything because I'm not a person. I can't be hurt. My feelings can't be hurt. But when we identify as the ego, we take things personally. And again, it lies to us and tells us if we don't take things personally, that someone will walk all over us. So we have to stand up for ourselves. But of course, that's another lie, because the truth is, if you did not resist and you didn't take something personally, but you weren't just passive and let someone just walk all over you, right? If you didn't resist, the right action would spontaneously arise in the moment out of the flow. And that could be meaning to be very firm and assertive. Now, I just said don't resist, but that's not the meaning of resistance, right? This is another trap. People think, and the ego lies and says, well, if you're going to be, non-resistant, that means you be passive and people will walk all over you. But that's not true. That's not true non-resistance. Non-resistance is a lack of energetic fight inside. You could be completely at peace, but extremely assertive, right? And, you know, if you look at some of the stories about the greats in history, whether it was Gandhi or Jesus or whatever, and sometimes they're extremely assertive, they're immovable, and yet there wasn't this energy of resistance and anger behind that. It was just an assertiveness of standing in your own authority from who you truly are. And so that's what would really happen if we were to be our true selves more and more and more. So those are like several major traps that, you know, can be pretty obvious once you just start looking for them. And the idea is to actually look for them, because when you're looking for them, the one that is looking for them and noticing them is not the ego. It can't be. The ego is the thought process that creates them. So how could it be what is aware of them? So the moment you're aware of them, you're already out of the ego by default. Now, of course, you can jump right back into the ego, which is what we tend to do. But you can also remain that aware in that space of awareness. And often if you do, the energy behind those will actually dissolve. When we have this desire or whatever it is, we think, oh, it needs to be met. Oh my God, it needs to be met. That's again, the lie the ego creates. But if you were just stay in awareness, for instance, I feel like getting that cookie, I feel like it. And if you're just, it would actually go away just in a little while if you aren't actually hungry, let's say. But the problem is we instantaneously follow it, and it's a reaction type of idea. So those are kind of the major traps. It's just to become aware of them, and the awareness itself has huge power. As long as we continue to stay in the awareness, it changes our behavior even. And the less we feed the ego, the less we believe it, the less we follow its commands, the less we are stuck in the thought stream, and the less our behavior is driven by the ego, the weaker it gets. Because it does not have, and this is key, it does not have its own energy source. Why? Because it's not real. So it's getting all of its energy and its entire life completely from our attention. Anytime we give, and how do we give it attention? By believing it, by being stuck in it, by following its orders. That's giving it attention, which gives it energy. So we are literally its battery source. And sometimes I hear people talking about, you know, solving the ego and killing the ego or whatever. And they talk about it as if it's this entity that's out to get them, that is not actually being completely driven by their own source of attention. As the awareness we have a choice, the free will of what to put our attention on. If we put it on the awareness that we are, on existence itself, we're in peace. If we put it on the ego, we give it energy and we feed it. And that's the giant real trap here, believing that, you know, it's not in our hands. And that's what it feels like, because so much of this is unconscious. But again, bringing all this into awareness really changes things. So those are the major traps, but I do want to get into just, I know I've been talking a long time, but I think these are very important. I want to get into some of the subtle traps, because once you become aware of the ego and start catching on to its traps, even if you still fall for them, you know, here and there, but the more you're aware of them, the more it has to get more ingenious to catch you. So it actually starts going more and more and more subtle. And the way it gets subtle, well, there's various ways of it gets subtle. I'll give you a couple examples. One way, for instance, so you realize that judgment is clearly the ego, it's negative, right? So you start being aware of that, and every time you catch yourself judging, and by the way, you're not going to become perfect and not judge. So the idea is not, obviously when you can, don't. But when you notice it, the way to get out of the ego is to actually just be forgiving of yourself, because the only thing that can be forgiving is your true self. If you start beating yourself up, that's just the ego. That's the subtle trap here, beating itself up. So you caught the original thing, but then the ego does what? Becomes the police officer that's catching it and beats you up and makes you feel guilty and ashamed. Now you've just fallen for a more subtle trap, right? Where the idea is to actually forgive yourself, even if it feels impossible because you did something so seemingly negative, let's say. But the way you do that is by taking the perspective of the awareness, not the person. That's the way to do it. And so that's a subtle trap. Another subtle trap of the same nature is when you become the policeman of other people. And I've fallen into this when I first discovered the ego. Then you just start noticing other people's egos. Now here, the subtle trap is now you're judging them from a place of, this is what the ego tells you, from a place of helping them. Now you're pointing out their egos. You're saying, you're telling them how they're being stuck in their ego, not realizing that the true self, who you really are, would not be judging them for being stuck in their ego. It would just be compassionate and loving. It wouldn't be policing them over their ego. So this one seems like a good judgment, like you're helping them, but it's bullshit, because unless they're asking for your help, you're not really helping them. And even if they are asking, you can give it in a much more compassionate, loving way than pointing out, their issues. And again, this is a tough one. This is something that I've struggled with because of my nature of being kind of having the propensity to teach. It's very difficult to sometimes not point out, how other people are falling into their ego, not realizing that the moment I'm doing that, I'm falling into my own ego, because that's not what love does. It doesn't point out and act like a policeman. So that's a big subtle trap. Another subtle trap is a subtle feeling of superiority, because you are quote unquote awakened and notice your ego, but others don't. And so that just creates a sense of separation, and making you feel, like better than. Another subtle way the ego catches you is by being identified with the role that you play. So for instance, I have the role of a spiritual teacher, quote unquote, right? But I've noticed that I can get sucked into that role and feel like I have something to teach others that they don't know, when in truth, that's not really true. Everyone at their core is one. At their core, their consciousness, and they know all this. Now on the relative level, fine, I might have something I could teach them. But if I take that to be an identity and I get attached to that identity, right, then I'm falling for the ego, because that's not who actually I truly am. So if tomorrow I couldn't be a spiritual teacher anymore, would that cause a huge amount of pain and lack of peace and feeling of unfulfillment? Well, if so, then I was really identified and attached to it, and it's actually a trap that I fell into, for example. And it can be any role: mother, teacher, businessman, whatever it is, right? A couple more traps real quick here, subtle ones that are important to know, to watch out for. Opinions. This one seems like so normal, natural, right? We all have our opinions, and it seems like there's nothing wrong with that. And there is nothing wrong with that if we don't take those opinions very seriously and invest attachment and belief in them. But the moment that we believe the opinion is true, instead of just an opinion that of course could be false always, that's the ego again, because now it's saying I own the truth. And what happens if someone disagrees with their opinion? And this is your gauge. If someone disagrees with your opinion, you get angry, you're identified with it, and that's the ego. Because why else would you feel? Who cares if they disagree with it? If you think about it rationally, what does it matter? Because it's the ego that wants someone else to believe what it believes, because that makes it feel more powerful, like it owns the truth. Why? Again, because it feels like a sense of lack, and it needs to feel more powerful. So that's that. And then finally, kind of in conjunction with this, is beliefs. So the more we are attached to our beliefs, that's the ego. It tells us, well, of course, this is because it tells us that our beliefs are not just our beliefs. It tells us that our beliefs are truth. So well, that's the way things are. Not realizing, no, that's just my belief of the way things are. So again, the more we get attached to our beliefs, the more we get sucked into a virtual reality where our whole worldview is being colored by those beliefs, and we fight others that disagree with our beliefs, and we don't stay open to potentially changing them if a more truthful reflection of reality comes into our awareness. So that's another trap, that it keeps us kind of sucked into its own world, let's say. So I think those are enough traps. There's a lot of them there, but I've experienced with all of them so much that I can talk about them quite a bit.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. That was pretty in depth. That was really good.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you covered a lot, from judgment to desire, regret, worry, pleasure seeking, distraction, taking things personally, and then all these subtle traps that you mentioned too, which, you find a lot in metaphysical circles or people that are into new age stuff. They, a lot of times it's the ego kind of dressing itself up in saintly clothing, right? It's a virtuous kind of signaling. But a lot of it's based on illusion and I guess, like you said, a sense of separation.
Yeah.
And a sense of desperation to be more. It's pretty crazy. So that covers a lot of the cons of the ego. And if you ask a normal person, what is the pro of the ego? Well, they say, well, like you mentioned earlier, it's great for going after what you want and your desires and all that kind of stuff. But that has a very deep downside too, which is the more you rely on that strong sense of ego to accomplish these things, the more you build up that ego, and it kind of eats away at you inside and gets you even more identified with the illusion, right? Mm-hmm. And what that ultimately seems to result in the end is a very massive learning lesson for yourself about what happens when you consistently choose the path of the ego. So I wanted to ask about the metaphysical purpose or pros of having an ego, for example, not only in its ability to give learning lessons, but also, do you think that there's ever a time where it's almost like the higher self or destiny or your spiritual path kind of takes you through a little ego detour to, I don't know, bring you to a certain place in life or teach you something? Do you think that ever happens?
Oh, for sure. I think that happens all the time. I know it's happened in my life countless times. And I think it's, you can explain it a couple different ways. It could be your higher self taking you through that because it's something you need to learn. Another way of explaining that is that who you truly are is completely allowing. So if there's some aspect of you that wants to experience the egoic self, it will allow that. Why? Because you will learn from it. You will create suffering. And once you've had enough suffering, you realize, okay, I don't want this. So, that's kind of how life flows in a way. And then sometimes it's almost as if we come into this life programmed in a way, destiny wise, to awaken at certain times. And we had to go through whatever had to go through to get to a point where we can awaken out of the ego. For instance, for me, it was basically huge ambition, huge desire to make a lot of money, very kind of materialistic outlook on certain things for a long period of time. And, I had to go through that to experience how unfulfilling it is when I achieved my desires. When you get the car and the house and there's still a complete lack of fulfillment. Not to say, again, that there's anything wrong with those. Not to say you can't have a very financially free, nice life. Of course you can, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just if you attach your happiness to that, if you think that's what will bring you happiness, you're going to be very disappointed. So there is that. And then there's also, I think sometimes you go through certain things that build the way for something in the future. So for instance, because I had all those, and let's say I achieved a certain level of financial freedom, that allowed me, for instance, to have the time to write a book, to put it out there very, for cheap prices, because I wasn't trying to make money from it, and helped a lot of people, allows me to kind of do what I do now, so there are obviously benefits that it allowed me a lot of free time to get into spirituality, into meditation, all that, where maybe I wouldn't have had if I had a 9-to-5 job that always took my attention. So there's it's a world of duality. There's always going to be good that comes out of it. And maybe it's meant to be like a foundation that builds the way for what you're truly meant to do later in your life. So that's why ultimately, even all these traps I'm talking about, everything that I just talked about, ultimately whatever is occurring is for the highest good on the ultimate level, meaning that if you're stuck in your ego right now, you're meant to be stuck in your ego because you're meant to experience the suffering and to learn from that. Not to say that become like this passive and say, well, I'm feeling shitty and I'm acting like an asshole to everyone, so I should continue doing that because, well, that's what's meant to be. Well, no, because once you're aware of it, clearly what's meant to be there is to be aware of it, and you have the choice to be out of it. When you're completely unconscious, you're completely unconscious. But when you're not, you have a choice. So that's key.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Because because when you're not conscious of it, then you're kind of along for the ride, and you get taken towards these instructive conclusions at the end, where you realize, wow, what an asshole I was, or wow, that didn't really turn out the way I wanted, or I wanted it only to realize I didn't want it in the end.
Yeah.
So a lot of it is kind of like that story of the prodigal son, going out into the world and experiencing it only, to come back to finally appreciate what the true natural state, what they had. Mm-hmm. So it's weird, this journey that we're on with that. So I guess it brings up the question then, some people, they seem to be scared of dealing with the ego because it feels like that's what they are. And, that they wonder, like, should I really be dissolving my ego, for example? Yeah. So there's different people that have different approaches to it. Like, some say we should dissolve our ego. Some say we should actually sharpen it and like put it under the control of a higher self, for example. When you talk about transcending the ego, could you like get into what that means to you and how to do it?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, what transcending the ego means to me, see, all these terms don't really capture the truth. We could say we're dissolving the ego. We could say, some people go as far as say, oh, I got to kill the ego. We could say we are putting it under the command of something higher. In reality, none of them are ultimately true, because the ultimate truth is that the ego is an illusion, doesn't even actually exist. So what is there to dissolve? What is there to put under the higher power? So that's the ultimate truth. Of course, that's not what we experience as true. We experience it as existing. Of course, I still believe I'm Ziad, right? And despite knowing and having experienced my true nature, it hasn't become this thing where it's just always my state of awareness, where I'm always my true nature, right? So it's kind of back and forth. Sometimes I experience myself as who I truly am. Sometimes I experience myself as Ziad much more often than I'd like. But the thing is that what does transcending it mean? Well, transcending it means that that you just, the way I look at it is don't so much focus on dissolving it, because what's really focusing on dissolving it usually is the ego itself thinking, oh, I'm gonna, and it's coming in the back door. Another subtle trap is like, I am going to, become enlightened. Well, who's this I that's saying I am going to become? It's the ego. It's saying it. But the way really to do it is to essentially focus on presence versus personhood in a way. So basically, the simplest and most direct way to, transcend the ego is to get out of the thought stream and drop more into presence. Presence means the awareness that you actually are, just being here and now without the thought stream. The less you get just sucked into this thought stream, this incessant thinking, the voice in our head that we think is us, the less you get sucked into that, the less you believe it. That's key. Believing the thoughts that it produces. The less you are in this fantasy realm, the less you follow its commands and just drop back into who you really are, the way, that's how you transcend it. So really transcending the ego is just as gradual, and usually it's gradual. Sometimes it happens subtly, but those are very rare cases. It's pointless to discuss them, because if it happens, it happens. And if it doesn't, it's going to be gradual. So usually the usual way is a very gradual movement from identification with the thought stream, following its commands and so forth, to being more in presence, more in a state of awareness that is just perceiving. And that seems a trap, of the ego tells you, well, that's boring. There's nothing going on. But why would I want that? That's one of the huge traps. I heard by the great spiritual teacher Adyashanti, he said once, at the gates of heaven, and of course this is an analogy, at the gates of heaven, there's one last, you can go through a lot of things. When you get to the final gate to actually get in, there's a huge sign there and it says boring. And that's what's the last defense of the mind to deter you from getting to your true self, because it seems like, well, what is there if I'm just being? What if I'm just perceiving sounds and smell and taste and touch? Well, that's it. And because the ego wants drama. But of course, that's another lie. That's another trap, because what there is actually, once you go through then the other side, there's tremendous peace, unshakable peace, serenity, clarity, love, joy, everything you actually were seeking from the desires of the ego is actually what's there, but it says boring, right? You just have to stay with the presence long enough to feel the subtle joy of it. And I've experienced that where I've, many times where I've tried be still and I'm like, oh, this is just boring, I'm bored. But then sometimes I fall for that and I just do something else. Sometimes I stay with it. And when I stay with it, this beautiful, just literally joy of just being just starts bubbling. And it's incredible. It's so beautiful just to experience it. There's just like fountain of joy just starts bubbling up just from being here. And this anything, you can call it anything, but it's not boring. That's the truth. And so the transcending the ego is just moving to a state of presence from personhood. That's really what it's about. There's a million different ways. We teach all these ways through all of our teachings. I mean, that's really what everything that we teach is centered around transcending the ego. It can be done directly, again, by being present, but another way to do it is by healing the unresolved emotions, so the direct path, let's just call it, so there's an indirect path and a direct path. The direct path to doing it is just realizing who you truly are as this awareness and resting in that awareness, resting in the I am that does not have any identification. That's the direct way. And you can do that. It's a practice of meditation. You can even do it going on your day, being in that. The indirect way, which indirect sounds like, well, that's less efficient than direct. Why would I do that? But it's actually needed, is because the vast majority of us have so much unresolved emotions, have so much stuff that is there that we need to resolve that to be able to even be in that direct presence. Because when we're trying to be in that, if we have all this unresolved emotions and unresolved stuff inside, it'll be so strong and so distracting, it'll keep us from being present. So the best way, I feel, is a combination path of doing these direct things, of meditating, just being in the now and dropping into the heart and feeling yourself as love or as just awareness moving through the world, but also working on your shadow material, getting in, allowing yourself to feel the emotions, allowing yourself to watch them from a place of compassionate witnessing. Breath work is something that can help with this. There's lots of techniques on conscious breath work. You can look those up on the internet. Conscious breathing actually starts digging these unresolved emotions up to be released. Now, it doesn't feel comfortable, so a lot of people run away from that because they just want comfort, but that's just the ego, right? If you go through the discomfort of bringing these negative emotions up that were repressed, it allows you to release them. And as you release them, you get lighter and lighter inside. So it's two ways, really. And I choose the combo path of, I don't like just the end. There's some people that just work on themselves endlessly. They're always doing emotional work and all that, but without the awareness that what I truly am doesn't need any work. What I truly am is already perfect. So the really way to do it is to do that inner work from the perspective of your true self, not from the perspective of a lacking human being that needs to do all this to become something better in the future so they can feel better about themselves. That would be a trap, and that'll go on forever and it'll never end, because then that's your ego doing it. The real way to do it is do that inner work, do the emotional work, do the breath work, do all these different things, meditation and all that, but from the perspective of the higher self that is choosing to embody itself into the physical form. And so it is already complete, and keep that perspective. So that's how you take the direct and the indirect and you marry them essentially together.
Yeah. So you're talking about a hybrid path, which kind of takes the best of both.
Yeah.
And doesn't fall for the pitfalls of each one. Cause I mean, you're right. There are people that can spend an entire lifetime just doing deprogramming and working on their shadow material, all that kind of stuff. But without ever, yeah. And I mean, I'm sure. A lot of us have gone through that phase until we realized. Yeah. And but what that does, right? It reinforces the assumption that we're not there yet, that we don't, that we aren't that we don't have it. So it reinforces the sense of lack, and no wonder then that it's this perpetual cycle of always being in that lack mode. So that's pretty profound. And then conversely, there's people who want to do only like positive, aligning themselves with their higher self, with their heart. But then a lot of times they slip up and they fall back into the ego mode over and over and over again. And that's because the ego is, sitting atop this mountain of repressed emotional energy and programs that are continually tugging at you, right? So just too much of a pull. So so definitely you got to reduce the pull by kind of helping heal and clean that up, while also focusing on what you truly are and what actually matters. So
exactly.
That's perfect. So I'm sure that doing that path, it comes with a lot of challenges, I'm sure. What kind of challenges have you faced, and how have you sort of been dealing with them?
Yeah. So, there's a lot of obstacles to transcending the ego. If there weren't, a lot more people would have completely transcended it. So it's a very challenging thing. But it's well worth the challenge, because each time you transcend some of it, you are more peaceful, more happy, more free. So some of the obstacles to transcending the ego, one huge obstacle I would say is that it is a chameleon and it's ingenious. So it's so good at masquerading as the true self. So basically, and I mentioned this before, like if you start noticing it and you're noticing your negative behaviors and all that, it'll take the role of the one noticing but become the policeman, right? Start making you feel bad for having an egoic thought, even though, you couldn't help it. It just happened. Or doing something bad, negative, but it calls it bad, right? So that's the ego. So that's it's a chameleon. Whereas the truth of the matter is, what actually happened is there was whatever egoic behavior or thought. There was an instant awareness of it, not by the ego, because that's what it was aware of it. But then the ego comes in and takes the role, seemingly, of the awareness and starts judging itself. And then, or others or whatever. And so it's a chameleon. It's ingenious. You find one trap, it gets more subtle. It starts hiding in different ways. You can find even true spiritual masters who still, have, for instance, an identity of being a spiritual master, or as a true, the final level, they don't have an identity of being anything. They just are. So, it gets more subtle, but what also gets more subtle is your ability to see its subtle traps. So you get more skilled at that as time goes on. The awareness that you are is able to pick it up more. So that's a constant challenge. Another constant challenge is the unprocessed emotions, is that repressed shadow side, because you can have this willingness and most motivation, inspiration to be present and to be your true self, but all of a sudden something happens that triggers this, what Eckhart Tolle calls the pain body. It just triggers it, and that's really difficult to be your true self when that's happening, and for me that was a real challenge for a really long time. And because it was so strong, there was so much rage and anger, whatever, all inside, that even though I would have the best of intentions to be loving and kind to my true self, something would get triggered and it would be so strong that, and you become even apathetic. You don't even care about being your true self anymore, because now it just wants to feed itself this energy. Now, I have not completely transcended this. I still have shadow material, I still have stuff. What has happened though, is that it has become a lot less powerful. And now when it comes up, for the most part, I can be aware of it. Now, it still catches me at times. It recently caught me where it was just so strong. It just came up suddenly. I was doing a lot of conscious breath work and all this stuff. And of course, that's digging deep. You're basically digging into the wound and letting it come up. And it came up really strongly. And, you know, it was a struggle to stay present with that. It's just such strong energy. And sometimes all we can do in those moments is just be forgiving of ourselves for not being able to stay present. And what can do that? Only our true self, because the ego is never going to forgive. So if you can't be present, at least forgive yourself for not being able to be present. That's a real good way to go right back into being present. Funny enough. So it was a non-resistance that is what does it. Of course, everything in our being wants to resist in that moment. So that's why it's not easy at all. So that's another thing. But again, that just, you know, the more you work through this stuff, the easier and easier and easier and easier it gets. In the past, years ago, what would happen is I would be in the state of inspiration. I'd be doing great. I'd be, you know, meditating, having profound experiences. I'd be loving and kind and not judgmental. And then something would happen, and I'll explain what will happen. What will happen is tremendous amount of fear will come up. Okay. Now, why will fear come? And this is actually another major obstacle. Now that I'm saying it, why will this fear come up? The fear is the fear of oblivion. Okay. And here's what I mean by that. The more you are your true self, the more you're experiencing that, what ends up occurring is the ego is actually, you know, dissolving, so to say. You're removing energy from it. Now, that's a good thing, but the way the ego experiences that is as if it's dying, right? And it starts thinking, well, wait a minute, when I become, because that's how it thinks, when I become my true self, well, what happens to the me that I think I am, right? So for instance, when I become pure awareness, what happens to Ziad? Is it going to not exist anymore? You know, and then it's a fearful thought, and it's a thought of oblivion, of non-existence. Of course, it's not true, because you cannot not exist. You always exist, and this you that is afraid of non-existing doesn't even exist to begin with, which is the real irony here. It's just a thought. Again, it's just a thought, but the thought is believed, and when the thought is believed, a tremendous amount of fear occurs that, oh my God, I'm going to cease to exist. And what the reality is, what would happen is you just start taking this character very lightly, and you are the awareness and you see the character, but you realize it's a role, and so you're not attached to it. That's all that would really happen. And I know this from speaking to people who are at that level, who are, you know, what would be called enlightened. And they just, it's not that they don't recognize that there is a sense of personhood. It's just that they are no longer that sense. They are sorry, I just knocked over my microphone. They are far greater than that sense, but they still respect and honor that sense. They still have normal roles in life, and life goes on normally. You don't just cease to exist when that occurs. But that's, again, the fear, the trap that the ego puts out there. And so in the past, for me, this is the greatest obstacle for me. You know, see, it's an ingenious chameleon. I can often notice his traps, and if I don't, eventually I catch onto it, right? And when I say I, here the awareness catches onto it. The unprocessed emotion is very difficult, but you can work through them. The fear of oblivion, this is the great one. This is what creates so much resistance, and it's at a very deep existential unconscious level. And so when it pops up, what used to happen for me years ago is I'd be, as I was saying, I'd be very focused on, being my true nature and all that, and it would be great. And all of a sudden this unconscious fear would come up, and it would be so strong, the resistance would be so strong that I would get sucked into or dive into an egoic state for weeks, like weeks of everything I know to be true, everything I teach, even like this even happened after I wrote my book a few times, where I know this stuff to be true, but this thing that comes up is so strong that for weeks I would just be pure ego, judging, being an asshole in relationships, getting stuck in the future and desires, all this stuff, right? Here's the thing, while realizing I'm doing it and I have like no control to stop it, which of course makes you feel guilty and all this stuff and brings shame, and it's all the ego. The whole thing's one giant ego trap. I would say the greatest progress that has occurred in my own journey is that now when that stuff comes up, instead of, let's say, taking weeks, now it could be minutes, maybe hours. If it's really a strong one, a couple of days are being unbalanced, but even within those days, I have many moments of presence, which would never occur before. I would just be completely my ego before. So now it's a lot less. There's a lot more holes through the illusion. There's sometimes peace during these things where there's like this background of awareness of being okay with this stuff happening. Or if I get sucked into it, sometimes it's just minutes or hours later and I'm able to be out of it. And then of course it plays out, that energy, that momentum, whatever is coming up plays out. It literally kind of leaves the system in a way. And then there's much more clarity again, much more inspiration again. And then so much more light comes in literally into the body, which digs up more darkness, and then another cycle comes up. So the difference is those cycles used to last so long, this high and low, so deep in the past. Now they become much shorter and less extreme. That's kind of the great progress, I would call it, that has occurred in my own journey. And the real key here is to not judge yourself. And this is the hardest part, is to not judge yourself when they're happening. So for me, especially with the role of a spiritual teacher, it's very difficult to not judge yourself when you're getting a bunch of shadow material, a bunch of this existential fear or whatever rising up. It's very difficult not to judge yourself or feel bad about it, because you feel, well, here I teach people, all these things, and now I'm not in this moment being able to handle it, where in truth, it's not for a lack of intention or free will. Sometimes it's just the momentum of this stuff just comes up and it's just too strong, and the only thing you can do is be forgiving of yourself, because the forgiveness is the true self coming in, and anything else is just the ego and you're just perpetuating it. So that's the truth of it.
Yeah, so it kind of comes in cycles then. It's not this gradual.
That's how it's been for me, at least.
Yeah.
I don't know about others, but I would assume for the most part, this is kind of I've heard, it's pretty much a universal thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, so I've got one final question for you.
Sure.
And it has to do with, so as you've talked a lot about how the ego is and what it feels like, and you touched also on what the transcendent state feels like. But I wanted to ask you just to paint a picture or describe for the viewers this positive transcendent state. What does it feel like? What thoughts? What goes on in your mind and in your heart? Like your feelings, your way of being, your activity. How do you recognize that you're in it? Or what happens when you have fully transcended the ego? What would you be like?
Yeah. So I have not fully transcended the ego, so I can't really speak to that other than from talking to or knowing a couple people who have, but I can talk to what it's like when you're in that state of transcendence for a period of time, and what that feels like to me. First of all, there's this just serenity. There's this relaxation of just there's nothing you have to do, even though stuff continues getting done. It's just this feeling of there's no burden. There's just this peace of a flow. That's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it, there's this truly magical quality to it. This awe of wonder. I can just be walking outside and and be like in awe of nature and all that. Now, the interesting thing that's happened with me is that it's no longer this thing where, like it used to be in the past, where it's been like, well, I'd be in that state and then I'd be out of it for so long. Now, even if I'm getting a bunch of shadow material, let's say I'm doing some inner work, a bunch of shadow materials coming up, and let's say in the morning I'm feeling that, you know, an hour later I could be outside and feeling the state of awe. So it's very intermittent now, right? Or it could be days on end where I'm in this state now. So it just depends. But so you're feeling this sense of awe and wonder about, and I'm looking outside, just looking at nature, the water, the trees, you know, just, you're like, wow. So there's that. And it doesn't even have to be something special. It could be you're just sitting there and there's no beautiful scenery, but there's this sense of aliveness to everything and the sense of newness and lack of boredom. If you're with others, there's a sense of presence with them, of just being there with them in that moment. So that's another aspect to it. Another aspect is just joy. You're just happy. Of course, because you're happy, you're much more kind. You're much more loving and forgiving and compassionate. So that's another aspect to it. You are grateful. Gratitude is a huge part of it. You're just grateful for being, not for anything in particular, just grateful for being. And then another aspect of it from an actual external manifesting side is that synchronicities just start occurring. Things just happen that, let's say, what the ego wanted to happen, something like, you know, let's say you're working on something truly meaningful. Of course, the ego is always going to jump in, try to co-opt that and make it like, well, I got to get this. I have to achieve this. Well, when you're actually in that transcendence, it just starts happening by itself. You know, synchronicity and all these things just start occurring, and it feels effortless and it just works, and you're in a state of joy while it's happening. So that's what the transcendent state feels like. For someone who becomes fully enlightened, so there is no more separate sense of self, and that's who they truly are all the time by default without any conscious effort, it's basically always like that. They're always in a state of, you know, peace. They have a lot of the time that state of wonder and awe, and the gratitude and joy, and there's no suffering. That's really what characterizes it. So obviously, you know, it's an inner utopia. That's, now, having said that, that does not mean they don't feel emotions, that they can't have a negative emotion, because just because, and I'll bring this up maybe to end with this, just because you transcend the ego, it doesn't mean it completely ceases to exist. And the reason for that is, if it were to completely cease to exist, you could not function in the physical. We've already discussed this, right? So some remnant, some thread of ego will remain as long as you are experiencing yourself as a human, right? As long as you're playing this human character. So some thread of ego will remain, which means that there's always a natural vigilance that will still occur, because it can repop back up. And so when you become fully, let's say, awake, that thread will remain there. And sometimes that thread carries with it some remnants of energetic stuff that wasn't resolved. That doesn't have to completely go away for you to fully embody who you truly are. It just has to, the intensity of it and where it is in the foreground has to recede enough for your true nature to be the foreground, right? But that thread will stay there, and sometimes there could be a negative emotion that comes up. The difference is, when that comes up in someone who is fully awake, it just literally comes up and it has nothing to hold on to. There's no sense of I that will take ownership of that and make it into a story or mental narrative or anything, and it'll just dissipate, and that's it. As simple as that. So sometimes they can't experience something that feels uncomfortable or negative. It's just that it can't last. There's nothing for it to land on. That's the difference.
Yeah, well, that really sums it up. So thank you for your really thorough information on the ego. I mean, it's one of the most in-depth discussions on the ego I've ever heard. So
it's an experience from quote unquote warring with the ego, or in truth is warring with itself. Who I truly am was never warring with it. But it's just basically going through this for so long that, yeah, I've gotten a pretty good, taste of what it can do and what it is, and how subtle it is. And for instance, let me give you a real-time subtlety right now in real time. as I'm saying this, I just noticed that the ego is saying, I know so much about the ego. That's just the ego feeling a sense of superiority, right? That's just the ego reinforcing itself. I was like, wow, yeah, that was a really good conversation. But it seems harmless, but it's not. It's actually that trying to put me, Ziad, at a higher level of someone who would, let's say, know less about the traps of the ego. That's another trap right there. So what happens is you can catch it in real time. Now, saying that could be another trap of saying, oh, look, I can catch it in real time. You see, this is how it works. I'm just giving it you a real time, you know, feed right here of how you work with the ego. Now, I can feel bad about it. I can feel like, oh man, how could I be authentic as a teacher if I'm no, but it's just happening. That's what you got to realize. It's just happening. You're not doing it. If you were doing it, you wouldn't be, right? So it's just happening. So what's the only appropriate response if I want to stay in the state? Forgiveness, compassion, a light smile, like, oh, there you go again. Okay, what else is new? And that's it. Then you move on. That's the best way to deal with it.
Yeah, it's extremely it's practical and profound.
That's a good way to end it.
Yeah, so I'll leave you with the final words.
Yeah, I mean that's what I want to say.
Awesome. All right, well, thanks a lot.
All right, thank you, Tom.